Episode 72, special guest Richard Ostler. Hello, my beautiful friends. I am so happy you're here joining me today. And I'm guessing you're going to be pretty happy to be here as well when you hear what I have in store for you today. Have you ever met a person that just exudes light and love and goodness? The kind of person where you feel like you understand the Savior more just because of who they are? Well, today is your lucky day because I have my friend Richard Ostler joining us. And that is exactly how I would describe him. I met Richard when I was a guest on his Listen, Learn, and Love podcast. I seriously could have talked to him all day long. He has this amazing gift for making people feel seen and heard, which is something I think we can all benefit from. So, without further ado, Richard, welcome to the Mixed Faith Relationship Podcast.
Thank you, Chris. I'm honored to be here. It's a very welcoming introduction, and you're doing great work. So I'm glad to be here.
Well, I feel like we make a pretty good team together. So this is just an honor to have you here. Well, Richard, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Richard Ostler. My wife and I live in Salt Lake City. I'm in my early 60s. We're the parents of 6 children and several grandchildren. I'm an active Latter-day Saint. And I've stepped in the space maybe 10 years ago when I was a YSA bishop and had a couple of gay men in my ward to just try to understand things from other people's perspective, especially experiences that I had no firsthand knowledge of. That's led me in a long journey just to want to do what I can do in my circle of influence to create a more inclusive, welcoming, understanding church so that more feel they belong and are needed and understood. And that's part of my vision of creating Zion. And so I have written 3 books that are at Desert Book and have started a podcast called Listen, Learn, and Love, and just do what I can do in my circle of influence. By profession, I'm a small business owner, which has taken me to Chris's part of the world. I've been to Longmeadow and Springfield maybe 30 or 40 times where Chris makes her home. And so I'm still a small business owner, but do this work also.
I love that. So I've got a bunch of questions just based off of what you just asked about. So the podcast. Well, actually, before that, I'm going to back up. Everyone always says so. They want to know your connection with David Ostler. Are you guys related?
David's my brother, so
Okay.
he's a little older than me, bright, thoughtful, doing good work. He's the author of a book in our faith community called Bridges, ministering to those um, who question. That's also at Desert Book and at Amazon. And he had adult children that stepped away from the church, and he's sort of a data guy. And so he wanted to really understand the data behind why people are leaving and what we can do to support those that leave. And there's also a big group of people that want to stay and kind of need an authentic way to stay versus some of the narratives we used to share with people that had questions. So, really bright, thoughtful guy. So, we're kind of in the same general space, and he's a good guy.
Well, I love that. I read the book Bridges, and that's definitely has helped me so much. And just I think it helped me to really understand. I think a lot of times when someone leaves the church, we have this idea that maybe they're being lazy or they're not doing this or that or they want to sin, and that just isn't true in most cases. And I think that book really brought me a lot of peace and helped me to just help me to kind of understand a different perspective. So for those of you that are listening that have not read that book, it's a fantastic book that I highly recommend. So, okay, so I had to get that question out of the way because people have asked me and I wasn't sure. Um, so, Richard, when did you start doing your podcast?
I think we started in 2018, and as I was ending my YSA assignment, I just felt a spiritual impression to step in the space of trying to bring more understanding to LGBTQ Latter day Saints, to be supportive of the church, our leaders and doctrine, but also to bring more understanding. So I started to make Facebook posts about church leader quotes and what we could do to support LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. And my son-in-law said my Facebook posts were too long for him to read on his Washington subway commute. That's you, Nico. And he said, you should start a podcast. And I had never even listened to podcasts, but I thought, well, I can do that. So we started our podcast. But by episode 4, I recognized that my heart changed listening to people outside of my typical circle. And that's what was really good for me in my YSA assignment. And I felt, well, having guests on the podcast that are walking roads that I'm not familiar with could help bring more understanding. And so that's what the podcast shifted into, is elevating the stories of Latter-day Saints we don't typically hear from, the stories I wish I'd heard earlier in my life. And that's how we came up with the name Listen, Learn, and Love, because that was part of my journey in my YSA assignment, is being willing to listen. Men are often really good at talking. And I felt a lot of the learning that's come into my life was being willing to listen. Then it gives me ability to learn. And often I have the trap of unearned opinions, where I have opinions about groups of people without ever talking to anybody in that group, or maybe just one or two. And then the ability to love, because I better understand a group of people, which is part of my baptism covenants, to bear, mourn, and comfort. So the podcast is just a labor of love. People can't donate to it, or it's not sponsored. It's just my effort within our faith community to elevate voices we don't traditionally hear from, so we can better support and better create Zion.
I want to point out, so Richard has 702 podcast episodes up to date, and it's just amazing. I wish I could say I had heard all of them. I haven't.
No one has. There's too many.
But it's just such a beautiful space. And I love that you've got, and it's not just people in the LGBTQ community, you've opened it up to just anyone that's in the margins.
Yeah, and you can go to listenlearnandlove.org and look for podcasts, and we've got them categorized because there's too many at 700. But if you've got a kiddo working through mental health or scrupulosity, or you're working to solve porn use or help someone to solve porn use, or you're a mixed faith marriage like your wonderful needed work is doing. So there's a lot of non-LGBTQ podcasts, Black Latter-day Saints, people dealing with death. So it's just all the more difficult subjects that don't need to be difficult. We just need to better tools to understand how to support people. So yeah, they're all there. And so sometimes I'll find, Chris, where someone just they kind of go to a category that's the new reality of their life, and they just hear stories. There's, within the LGBTQ space, there's like parents that are raising LGBTQ kids. That's often helpful for parents that are new to the space. They've got a kiddo that just came out to them. There's lots of LGBTQ Latter-day Saints sharing their stories. And so there's just trans is a whole different group within that group. So there's just a lot of stories within that broad podcast library, I guess you'd call it. And the listeners and the guests are the heroes of the podcast. I don't try to say too much. It's unusual for me to be on a podcast talking, because most of what I try to do is get people like you talking, because that's how people's hearts change.
Well, I highly advise listeners to go and check it out, because it's just such a great resource. And you've had a lot of different people, book authors or life coaches like myself, or therapists. Just, there are a lot of great resources on so many different topics. So it's just such a beautiful thing. So you talked about the name of your podcast, Listen, Learn, and Love. And I just love that idea. And I don't know if you noticed this, just in the last general conference a couple of days ago, I was thinking about you in Elder Bednar's talk, the one about the last wagon. Did you hear that one?
Did.
The very first talk. And I was just thinking, that's what you do, is you're one of those. For those of you that didn't hear the talk, he was talking about how there's a lot of people that do big things in the church that get recognition, but then there's a whole bunch of people that are just good, kind people that are trying to keep their baptismal covenants and to love and to support. And that I thought of you. So I thought that was a beautiful, I love that talk. If you haven't heard it, go listen to it. So one of my questions is, how do we listen, learn, and love better?
Well, that's a good question. I love a quote from Elder Uchtdorf. He says, "How often has the Holy Spirit tried to tell us something we needed to know, but couldn't get past the massive iron gates of what we thought we already knew?" So I think we have to be curious. And there's a book called The Sin of Certainty. I think we have to be curious. Another one of my institute teachers, Michael Wilcox, says it's better to be superficially, well, I'm paraphrasing, I can't even get it right, but basically it's okay to be curious. And so I think it's a spiritual gift and something we need to make sure in ourselves, that we're open to learning. And so, I think it's a gift. And I think as we're open to learn, like Elder Gorfs and Tart invites us to do, we do better. When we know better, we do better. My own personal stories, when I had priesthood responsibility for a couple of gay men that were brave enough to open up, I recognized I knew very little about this space, and I wanted to do the right thing. So I didn't tell these gay men anything. I just said, keep talking to me. And then I did what I call a hard drive reset, where I recognized everything I learned about gay people was from straight people. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't know what was accurate or not. And so I just said, I'm going to wipe my hard drive clean because I didn't know what was accurate or not. And I'm going to let LGBTQ people and their parents define them for me so that I can follow the impressions from Christ to do what I can to help these good men on their journey forward. So that principle scales to other groups of people that your listeners may know lots of groups that I don't know much about, but I think it's better not to have opinions about groups of people until we get to know lots of people. And so my heart has grown. My love for human population has grown both in and out of our church. People that are just different than me. I used to think Zion was sameness because I grew up in a very same environment in Salt Lake City. Now I think Zion is unity and diversity. And we're taking all of our differences, God given differences, which are good, and using them to bless our combined effort, harmony, and unity to bless the lives of others. But I think we have to be curious and not certain about everything. And that, I think, leads to growth.
I have never thought of curiosity as a spiritual gift, and I love that. That's wow, that's a big aha moment for me. I know in my own with my own family, with my husband and my kids, there are curiosity has helped me so much, and it helps me to love them because like you said, and that whole idea of wiping the hard drive clean. I think when we do grow up in with people that look just like us and believe like us, and this, um, we often yeah, we don't understand their experiences. So as a parent, that's something that I really tried to do, is to get curious when my kids are sharing something with me that is hard for me, or they don't want to hear, or maybe I have a very different opinion, just to stop and just ask lots of questions. I think that has been, and I think too, so often when we're talking to people, we are not really listening. We're thinking about what we should say next. And I think listening is not trying to prove our side or trying to share our opinion. It's really stopping to listen and just, yeah, being curious. As a coach, that's exactly what I'm doing with people, is I'm just being curious and asking lots of questions to help understand them, and it helps them understand themselves as well. So I love that it's a spiritual gift. Love it. Um, okay, my next question. So you have, in the space that you've talked to so many people, you've got people that are in the church, you've got people that are out of the church sharing their stories. And what stands out to you in your work with people in mixed faith relationships?
Uh, Good question. I've written 3 books for your listeners under the Listen, Learn, and Love name, and you can find them at my website, papaostler.com. And there's just links to Amazon or Deseret Book. But in all 3 of these books, we've kind of touched on this space of because the first book is about, supporting LGBTQ Latter-day Saints, and sometimes they leave the church. And so what do we do when someone leaves the church? And I think if we really own our doctrine, we can find peace, as you know well, with people that have left our church. And I think and where I go with that is loving heavenly parents that created us. And ultimately, they're our parents, they're our spiritual parents, and they were our parents before we had earthly parents. And I believe they want to do everything they can to get all of their children back that continue to want to progress. The church has no official statement. Can we move between kingdoms in the next life? In the 1960s, the First Presidency released a statement. We have no position on that. Different apostles have said different things on that. I don't think that means eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we can move between kingdoms. I think what that means is our heavenly parents want to do everything they can to help all their children back. And we should be at peace and say, what can I control as a parent? And what I can probably control, if it's still somewhat as a two-way street, is the relationship. I can preserve the relationship, and I don't have to own the outcome. And I can leave this all at the Savior's feet, because I have this, for LDS believing listeners, I have this understanding of the plan of salvation, that these kids voted for the same plan I did. They're here experiencing mortality, and God loves them first, and my job is to love them. So many of the parents in this first book shared, most of my books aren't me talking. It's more just like I do in the podcast, bring forth other voices. Most of the parents that have kids that have stepped away after just praying and thinking about it said, just love your kids and leave everything at my feet. And parents that get that personal revelation just kind of go, I can do that. Unless it's a toxic situation where there's needed boundaries. So that's sort of the space I invite people to be in. And in this third book, I wrote a chapter. The third book is called Listen, Learn, and Love, Building the Good Ship Zion. I'm kind of bouncing between books. This is the most recent one. And one of the chapters is how should we treat those that leave the church?
Tell us all about it.
It's not an invitation to leave the church, but it's using, gospel principles and leader quotes to be kind to people that separate themselves from the church. It's a two-way street. I don't like sometimes the tension that exists between those in the church and those that leave. And there's wonderful examples of how to reduce that tension. And I won't read the whole chapter, but there's, some wonderful real life stories. One that I think of as Ginger, who posted on Facebook about her leaving the church, and some stranger just validated how she felt. And she learned he's a stake president in Utah and just said, I'm grateful you shared how you felt. Now, he didn't compromise church teachings just to validate how she felt. He can do both. And eventually, coincidentally, even though she was an excommunicated member, she moved into his stake. And her records aren't there, but he became her stake president, and he invited her to speak to all the bishops about her journey to leave the church. It wasn't inviting the other bishops to leave the church, but it was to create understanding of why some people separate. And it was incredibly healing for her. She didn't come back to the church, but the anger, the tension, the not being seen, so it was a beautiful love story of creating unity and kindness in people that were walking very different paths. And this stake president, whose name's in the book, didn't sell out our doctrine to be kind to her. I think he just practically applied it. Yes. So there's wonderful stories of being kind to people that separate themselves from the church. I went through what I call a mini faith crisis. So I kind of walked this road. During my YSA assignment, all the narrative I heard about people that separate themselves from the church, it's because they're lazy, they want to sin, they're not really fully in. It's this kind of unkind narrative. And then suddenly I became one of these
Mhm.
as a YSA bishop, and I recognized, well, that's not true. You know,
Yeah.
I had more chances to baptize people. It's the first time I walked in the baptism font since my own mission to honor to baptize 3 YSAs. And so I was having all these really positive experiences, but realizing the reality of the road for LGBTQ members caused some dissonance for me. And so, I've managed to stay in the church and traditionally believing member, but I understand the challenges that members face. And most want to stay in the church, but they need sometimes the tools to help somebody join the church are different than the tools to help somebody stay in the church. And they sometimes need a new model or new paradigm. That's kind of a sidetrack. But if they leave, I think we should just, acknowledge their agency. Elder Uchtdorf said some kind things about people that separate themselves from the church, and that's in my brother Dave's book in this chapter. And just honor their agency and try to reduce divisiveness and maybe even work together to solve world problems between those in the church, those that have never been in the church, and those that have left the church, because they have gifts and contributions. And let's just see them as God's children doing the best they can. So that's one of the stories, but there's just another story in that chapter is Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand,
Mhm.
who's a not participating Latter-day Saint, and President Nelson came to visit her, and here's a sitting prime minister who's a lapsed Latter-day Saint. And all the public comments President Nelson made about her were very kind and recognized what an incredible prime minister, the work they're doing, President Nelson's commitment to work with Prime Minister Ardern, who's since stepped down with the Christchurch shooting and maybe a bombing in there, an earthquake in there. And so he didn't, at least publicly, he didn't say anything shaming about her. She's one of the most respected female leaders in our world, and just an
Yeah.
incredible human being. I heard her speak at Harvard at our daughter's graduation, and she mentioned her Mormon roots and in a positive way. And she brought it up in this commencement speech at Harvard University, and in a very respectful, thoughtful way. And so she didn't diss on the church, to use that language. So there's this space where we can be respectful of each other, but it's a two-way street. And there's some real examples in the book on how to do that. But I think as Latter-day Saints, our doctrine allows us or even invites us to be kind to people and not form opinions about people like I had done that have left the church until we talk to a lot of people that have left the church, and or don't say anything about them.
It made me think of, with my coaching that I do, it's interesting because a lot of times we're when someone leaves the church, we start, unfortunately, we judge them, or we preach to them, or we start trying to control them or try to make them come back. And it's interesting because as we do those things, we end up leaving the church, in a sense that we're not following Christ and trying to live the doctrine that we profess to believe. So it's interesting how, sometimes I find myself in that space, like, oh, I'm judging them, and I'm not doing the things that I want to be doing right now. I'm not showing up as the person that I want to be. So I think, yeah, that's something that we need to pay attention to. And are we being loving and kind and living the things that we profess to believe? Yeah, I love that.
I
Oh, go
I
ahead.
I agree with you. Two thoughts come in my mind: is if you're new to this road as an LDS parent, and you know this as well as I do, because of your coaching, is there's grief and there's changed expectations, and your hope for your kids change. You've thought about temple marriages and all your grandkids being raised LDS, so there's real grief. Neither of us want you not to feel that grief. Grief is a normal human emotion you need to work through, and lots of times a life coach can help you because they have skills. But then you get to this space of acceptance and peace, where it's the new reality and you're at peace with it. And then I think of the second thing I thought of is non-transactional love, which Steve Young talks a lot about in his book, The Law of Love.
Love that book.
And it's just sort of I love, we have some kids that aren't participating in church right now, and my love for them is not transactional in nature. I just am honoring their journey, and I love them where they are, and I don't see them, are they going to church or not, or will this conference talk affect them or not, or even they listening to conference or not. I pray for their spiritual, mental, and physical health, for their safety, that they'll make good decisions. But I don't even, I guess, in my relationship with them, it's not transactional. I'm not thinking, what will this do to help them come back to the church? I just love them because they deserve to be loved, because of my understanding they're heavenly parents, divine children who chose the same plan I have, and they're theirs first, and I'm going to just love them. And they'll be, and if they had a change of heart, they might open up a little easier if they hadn't had to dug their feet in the ground. And I haven't said, I told you so, you're going to be unhappy and you're going to come back. And so that's sort of language that creates it harder for someone to have a conversation, or if they had a change of course, to come back, versus just, I love you. And I see the good. One of the things that people that have left the church tell me is that sometimes their parents can only see them as in the context that they've someone that's left the church. And sometimes they've accomplished incredible things in their life, career-wise, in other ways. And they're remarkable people doing incredible things. And they don't feel seen sometimes for those contributions. And so I think it's good to see people in the ways that they're doing good within society. And I just think that's part of how you preserve the relationship and keep communication channels open and decide what are our common goals. And a lot of families in mixed faith can decide, we have a goal like my brother talks about, we're going to have no empty chairs at the vacation, at the family dinner table. And we may have differences in politics or difference in religion, but we can learn to love each other and be with each other. So that's a second thought under non-transactional love.
And I heard this might have been someone on your podcast the other day, but I love this idea. I think in the church we think of no empty chairs in with our eternal families, but before we think about that, let's not have empty chairs now. What can we do to include people and to pull people in now? And I love what you were saying for about seeing our loved ones for their contributions now. It's so easy to label someone like they're like they're not in the church, and we make that a focus instead. That's just like a little thing among all the good things that they're doing, and to focus on what they are doing, that the story that we tell about our people. That you know I think it's easy when my oldest left the church, people would say, "Oh, how's she doing?" And I would be like, "Ugh," I had this story that she wasn't doing the things that I wanted her to be doing. And I had to really stop and look at that, because the more you tell yourself a story, it's kind of like you're punching yourself in the face. And it's a painful story. So I had to really look at that and think, so yes, there is this, and I am working through those feelings that you mentioned earlier. Those feelings definitely come up: the grief, the sadness, the disappointment, that stuff that we want to work on. But then as I let myself feel those feelings, then I started looking at, okay, so she's doing this and this and this, and she's happy and enjoying. And I started focusing on that story instead of this other story that I had been telling. And I mean, I can look at them either way. They're both true, but one of them feels so much better, and it helps me connect with my daughter and, with my other kids as well. So I love that.
And I love that. And two things came to mind is some parents, when a kid leaves the church, their faith community just, they don't know what to say. So it's kind of radio silence. So I think it's good that we ask about your daughter, and you have the skills to talk about her and all the good things she's doing. And A lot of parents want to continue to talk about their kids that have stepped away from the church. And sometimes if we know they stepped away from the church, the usual questions we ask, like, we don't know how to ask other questions, like, tell us about their career, or tell us about their education, or where are they living, and what are the good things they're doing in their life. And it keeps that connection. The word you still need support from your word family. If you've got a children that have stepped away from the church, you need to feel like people. And then in a trusted relationship, sometimes people need to open up to you about the realities of their kids that aren't active in the church, and
Yeah.
how to minister to families that have kiddos that have obvious physical illness, or but sometimes parents, we don't know what to say sometimes to parents if we know their kids aren't participating. And I don't think you can ask out of curiosity, or just, but a trusted friend can say, how, do you want to talk about your daughter that I'm not sure if she's going to church? I don't know. It's just a one-on-one sensitive thing, but often that gives permission for the parent to open up and us to bear mourn and comfort. And then we can't have, back to your empty chairs. Somebody coined that as sad heaven, as we mourn now a future outcome. We conclude, because some of our kids aren't active in the church, that we are going to have empty chairs in the next life. And I think we just can't mourn a future outcome.
I have no idea.
We have no idea, Chris. And so let's don't have sad heaven. Let's just don't do that. So just some thoughts on what we can do to support each other.
And I think a lot of that, going back to those emotions that come up, well, Richard and I have both had lots of time to process these emotions and go through these things. This isn't something that just happened to me immediately. This is years and years of work. And I think it's important to let yourself feel that sadness that's coming up, because, of course, it's not what we're disappointed. This isn't what the movie that we're watching doesn't match the movie we thought we were going to be in. And to let those emotions come up and to deal with those now, and so we're not focusing on that sad heaven idea. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Oh, so many great. I love all the your ideas and the things that you've brought up. What else do you have for us, Richard?
Well, this is, our kids are all on, they're probably from 23 to 33. And so we've gone from, raising our kids. I think it's harder to raise kids in their 20s and 30s, because it's really where they make their own decisions. Some kids
Yeah.
make decisions earlier church wise. At least in our family, we've recognized there's more diversity of thought politically and religiously. And so I don't think we have any, we want to do anything different feelings, but because I think we did the best we could. And I don't look at where our kids are with the church as a measure of our success or failure. We have really great kids doing wonderful things, but I would try to create a family culture where our kids would open up to us. So I remember a second grader coming home and hearing it and telling and swearing, and it kind of was shocking. And I sat with that for a second, and I said, I can't remember what kid it was, but I said, you can tell me any word you hear at school, and this is how I will respond, because you're going to hear some words that are swear words. You don't even know it. And I wish I'd kind of extended that and said, okay, if you have questions about the church, this is how I'm going to respond. If you've slipped up and looked at pornography or messed up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, this is how I respond. There's still family rules and family standards, but let them know in advance how you respond. And I think it doesn't increase the chance they're going to mess up, or give them permission to mess up, but I think it helps create a feeling that you as a parent are a safe person.
Mm-hmm.
If you a lot of families are going to have LGBTQ kids, and they're going to become aware of this earlier, just because there's more acceptance. I don't think it's a sign of the last days that more identifying as LGBTQ. I think it's just they're able to own this part about themselves earlier. And I think that's a good thing, because parents can walk this road with them earlier. But you might even, say, if you feel, it's got to be age appropriate. If you feel you're not straight or 100% heterosexual, or you have feelings for somebody of the same sex, romantic feelings, this is how I respond as your parent. I don't think it's going to cause your straight kid, to be not straight.
Yeah.
I think So one of the greatest things as parenting we can do is to walk with the kids in the reality of their lives, even if it's hard for us to realize that's the reality of their life. Having them just walk that closet or alone or in shame. There should be no shame about sexual orientation, but some that's sin related, there might be shame. I just think we do better when we create a culture that our kids can open to us, the reality of their life, mental health, feelings about feeling suicidal. Talking to your kids about suicide in appropriate ways isn't going to increase the likelihood that they're going to be suicidal. But if you've got a kiddo that's suicidal for some reason, and they've already heard in their mind that mom and dad have already told me this is how they respond, it may allow them to open up. They may be a victim of sextortion. We just talked about that on a podcast where, they've got a bad guy in their life that's, milking them for money because they've caught a hold of one of their inappropriate pictures. And so they don't want to talk to mom or dad about that. And so there's some stories about kiddos that have, taken their life instead of,
Mm,
and so that's just some examples in this broad umbrella of creating a family culture. And if you're a local leader, in our church, young men's, young women's bishop, you could talk about these. If I'm a bishop, if you're in a faith crisis and wondering if the church is true or not, this is how I respond. If you open up to me, I
yeah.
won't say this or this or this. I will say this or this or this. And you may create a culture that says, because some people just privately work through a faith crisis, then just leave all at once. And it's been a 5-year thing where the only people they felt safe to open up to are people who are sort of out of the church because they don't feel safe talking to people in the church. And so creating a culture in our wards and families where people are safe to open up really helps people.
And I think it's interesting because when people are investigating the church, we
Yeah.
are like, ask any question, whatever, and we're so like willing, and there's no weird questions. And then when we have people that are questioning that are members, then all of a sudden it's like, I mean, we say you can ask any question. Joseph Smith started with a question, but then we react with fear or um, and then we shut people down. So I think I love what you were saying about that. And it goes back to that curiosity instead of telling them this is what you should do. A lot of times if we just zip our lips and just listen to what they're saying and help me understand this experience for you. What's it like to walk in your shoes? What do you and to yeah, to ask those questions, then they're going to feel like they can come to us. My one of my kids before they went off to college, they said, "Do you want me to tell you what you want to hear or what's really going on?" And I had to think about that for a minute. And I thought, I want to know what's really going on. And I had to really work on when they do open up and share things with me, and they do. And I'm so thankful that they open up with me is like watching my reactions and not respond instead of react. And I think that is it's a hard thing to do, and it definitely takes practice, and I certainly don't do it the way I want to all the time, but that's my goal, is just trying to show up with compassion, curiosity, and be in a place where you don't freak out when they tell you something. It's okay to go freak out after, and to allow those emotions doesn't mean you need to be okay with it, but just to be a soft landing spot where they can come and tell you what's going on. And that I think my biggest goal, I just want my kids to know I'm going to love, and my husband, my people, I want them to know I'm going to love them no matter what. There's nothing that you can do or say that's going to make me lose that love. I might be disappointed or sad, and I'm going to allow those emotions, but I am not, but I don't like the word but. I like the word
You too.
and I'm going to love you. I'm going to love you. So, and I can tell you had something to say.
I just love all that you're saying, Chris. And you make a really good point about us honoring questions and being curious more. And one of the thoughts of this third book about how do we is the book is sort of it's entitled Good Ship Zion, and the visual imagery is this is the Good Ship Zion represents our church, and there's room for people to sit and stand, and there's room for differences on that boat. There should be no belief or behavior hurdle to feel welcome in a congregation. The gate narrows at the temple where there is a belief and behavior hurdle. So let's create a culture where people, we kind of meet them as they are. But often I think people, you brought this up in my mind, people considering joining the church may watch how we treat people that leave the church, because
Mm,
they may not know how church will work out for them long term, and they want to be as part of an organization. It's kind of those considering getting on the boat or joining the church as those that are leaving the boat. And so I
yeah.
think we can model that, just to your point. And another thought that came to my mind is sort of, back to my faith crisis, what kept me in the church. And I had to think about, this is for those that are sort of trying to stay in the church and maybe in a faith crisis. I used to say, I know the prophet Joseph Smith's a prophet. I know the Book of Mormon is true, and I still believe that. But I had to go to the so what of that, and the so what of that for
Mm,
me is the unique doctrine that came through the Restoration. It's unique to our church, and it exists because of Joseph Smith's prophetic mission, including the Book of Mormon, and that is, things like heavenly parents that love us, plan of salvation. It gives context for a really wounding mortality, and a savior who has the capacity, because his atonement, to heal us along with therapists and take sin away, a better understanding about Adam and Eve. And just so there's so much unique doctrine that came through the Restoration that to me does two things: it brings hope and it brings healing. And that doctrine applies to this space of having family members that leave the church, is we have context to process that. Somehow in this plan, most of God's children, 99%, have never been in our church in all of mortality. So God, on some macro level, is comfortable with by far the majority of his children never having a chance to even hear about our church, let alone join, let alone leave. That maybe in his grand plan, we can be at peace that he has a plan here, even for those that separate themselves from the church, that he loves them, and he writes the rules, and he's the enforcer, the writer, all those things. So our heavenly parents can decide, how things work out eternally. And what we can do is what we've talked about in this podcast is just love unless there's boundaries because it's toxic, and just leave everything at the Savior's feet. So that's where I find peace and hope in my life as a Latter-day Saint, with people walking different paths all around me. That's what keeps me sort of in the church as a member of the church, is that sort of foundation.
I love that. Love it. It makes me think of the sister, I can't remember her name. She spoke in conference Saturday night session with a red coat.
Sister Tammy Runya.
Yes. I loved her. I love that talk so much. I can't wait to like go back and just study that. How she was talking about the important, we're standing there eating the fruit, and if we're standing there sobbing, and the message that sends to our people, and to show the joy, the so what that you talked about. The so what is where we feel that joy. And yeah, I love what you had to say, and I love that talk. The other thing that I was thinking when you were talking is
I love that talk too.
pardon.
I love that talk too.
Um, the other thing I was thinking about, going back to the stories that we tell about our people, I always like to think of what's the story that God tells about my kids or my husband. And I don't think God's freaking out. I don't think he has, well, clearly our heavenly parents have the big picture. And I think that as humans, we panic and freak out, and then we operate out of fear. And Christ has said over and over again, like, to perfect love casteth out all fear. When we operate from fear, it doesn't help us show up in our relationships with any of the people. So, oh, anything else you want to share, Richard?
There's one chapter it's in this third book, for your listeners, Building the Good Ship Zion. And all my books, the proceeds go to a scholarship fund for a gay Latter-day Saint who died by suicide. So I'm
Mm.
not trying to um, great royalties, at least for his foundation. But one of the chapters that's really sensitive in this book is ministering to those with church-generated pain or trauma.
Mm.
And it's written by an LDS therapist because I have no experience. But most Latter-day Saints have never felt pain that resulted from their church. Their church is the source of healing from pain that comes in the world. There's a group of people that committed Latter-day Saints that this church at times has been a source of pain. A leader comment, an interaction, a calling. Maybe they've even been a victim of an assault from a church member. And so we know the gospel of Jesus Christ is perfect, but I like to think our leaders, our culture, our people are not perfect. And because of that, it's possible it could inflict capital T trauma or lower tree drip, drip,
Mm-hmm.
drip, drip trauma. And a lot of Latter-day Saints, their natural fight or flight is I want to separate myself from the source of that trauma. And maybe even driving around the building or going to the building, if that sort of represents the trauma, is triggering for them. And their heart would naturally want to separate themselves. At the same time, it's sort of like two things are true. They have a testimony of the church and they want to somehow get through that trauma so they can return or continue to participate or not feel anxiety. And so this is part of this space. If you haven't felt something like this, it's possible that others are feeling it or have felt it. And this is a chapter written. I haven't felt a lot of church generated trauma. I've had a couple rocky relationships with a couple of leaders, but nothing major. So I don't know this space in any way personally, but I've sat with enough people, and you probably have too, that I
Yeah.
recognize this is the story for some people. And so this is a chapter that, if you're a parent, a local leader, or somebody that's in the middle of trauma, some people separate themselves from the church because they need to heal outside of the church. And that seems, how could, and so we need to validate just individual paths within this broad human family. And some have separated themselves from the church. They just need to heal. They can take Christ with them. I think we need to be careful to say the only access to Christ is through. I think Christ is bigger. I access Christ through my membership in the church, and my covenants bring me closer to Christ. But if somebody has separated themselves from the church, I don't think we can say to them, well, God is not accessible to you, and the
No.
power of Jesus is not accessible to you, because this is the God that's the God of the whole world and the Christ of the whole world. So people need to feel they can still have a connection with God in Christ, even if they're not fully participating in the church or separated themselves from the church, because I think that's our doctrine.
Yeah.
And we need to allow our doctrine to heal people, even if they're not in the church right now.
I think if we could talk all day, I think that idea of trauma, and it's hard, if let's say that your loved one comes to you and says, I have experienced this trauma, it's really hard to not take that personally.
True.
And it's easy to get defensive in a situation. And I think it's important to realize like that was not my experience, but to validate and to listen to people that is their experience and not to take it personally. And I think that's a big place where a coach or a therapist can help you, because sometimes it's hard to hear stuff like that and to separate like, okay, they had a hard time with the church, but I don't have to make it, I don't have to become defensive and make it mean something about me, which we do. So
Can I shift gears completely?
totally.
Um, I have mentioned we do a lot of podcasts with transgender Latter-day Saints, and this is a group of Latter-day Saints, because of our politics, have sort of found themselves in the crossroads, and sometimes we get um, political in our views within church or within society, and we create what I call common enemy intimacy. That it's the opposite of true belonging. If the bond we share is simply we hate the same people, we
Mm,
experience a lot of, this is a Brene Brown quote, the the you know we do connect that way, but it's not long-term authentic connection. It creates
mhm.
anxiety and stress, and it's not the way Christ created belonging. He created around love versus fear of another group of people. The church's website is very kind to trans people. Elder Razvan has a quote on there that is very kind to trans people. But I've been talking a little bit about a transgender Latter-day Saint who, this is a trigger warning for your listeners, who lives in Massachusetts, who died by suicide. His name is Levi Martin. And his parents have been on the podcast, but they've allowed me to see the suicide note. It's just the most sacred space. I've never seen something like this. But as this young man who's transgender and actually had a diagnosis of why he felt this way, I'll just read one sentence in his suicide note. This is Cammie and Dave Martin's son, Levi, and they've given me permission. He's a member of a stake presidency in Massachusetts, a faithful Latter-day Saint trying to raise a transgender son. But this is what he put in his suicide note. I am terrified of how society treats transgender people. And that was, and his love for his parents. And in the obituary, they wrote this message using his preferred pronouns and his preferred name. His final message was full of grace, love, and forgiveness, as well as expression of the vast difficulties faced. He signed his name Levi, which we deliberately use to honor in his honor, and ask you to do the same. So, listeners of your podcast, I just hope that we're not creating common intimacy at church where we're bagging on groups of people, groups that have left our church, our family culture the same way, LGBTQ people, trans people. We can create a lot of connection that way, and we laugh and we joke, but it's not a higher, holier law of that you talked about. Perfect fear casteth out love. So that's a really tragic personal example. We all want to do the right thing. We'd never think that our rhetoric could contribute to somebody feeling suicidal about who they are. So LGBT community flooded with kind messages about them in our families, in our churches, and in our political conversations, because I think it's what Christ invites us to do as I look at his ministry. So that was a complete tangent, but since you're in Massachusetts, I think this family's on the other side of Massachusetts, but it's just a way when we know better, we can do better.
Yeah. Oh, Richard, that's wow. And I think that's the big thing is we are trying to build bridges. We don't want to put walls up between our loved ones. And that's the way we build bridges is by listening to people, learning from them, and loving from them or loving them. So, I just love that. Anything else you want to add before we wrap things up?
Just the work you're doing is really needed, and you're really brave to talk about your own family situation, and vulnerability brings vulnerability. So Chris is role modeling this when she talks about her whole family that's not active in the church right now. I'm sure when you never thought this would happen, or you'd be talking about it. But vulnerability brings vulnerability. So I just know that because of the podcast you've done on our platform and your work on your own platform, that I can talk to Chris Rich. She'll get it. I can be vulnerable with Chris Rich because she can handle the realities of my life. And so I think, my final invitation is to be like Chris Rich and be vulnerable in appropriate situations so that it creates authentic connection. It often creates deeply spiritual, thoughtful connections that sometimes we're yearning for in Latter-day Saint culture, where sometimes we're needing to be our perfect selves with the perfect answer and the most thoughtful comment. And all of those are good, but sometimes it's just good to be vulnerable and real and authentic. And that takes bravity is not a word, but it takes being brave. So my final comment is let's be more like Chris Rich.
Well, that was very sweet. I love, thank you. Thank you for your kindness. I think of vulnerability, and this might even be a Brene Brown quote. I can't remember, but somewhere I heard that vulnerability is a superpower and it connects us to people. So yeah, I think sharing our stories, sharing the hard things, and that we don't have to like I always think about if I want to hang out with someone, I want to hang out with a real person. I don't want to hang out with someone that's perfect, that has it all together, because they're probably not telling the truth. But well, oh, what were you gonna say?
I agree, and I think women are a little better doing that than men. I think in church talks, often women get a little vulnerable. Sister Roberto talked about the suicide of her own father
Yeah,
in no conference talk, and so my respect and love for her just went up. And
yeah.
Elder Holland has talked about his own mental health and normalized mental health with one of his great talks. So we sometimes remember these, and Sister Runya,
Hmm.
it was pretty real. And we know Sister Runya coincidentally. She had a son who died that was married to our niece, and so she knows really
Oh,
complicated stuff, and she may share more of that and just her lovely family. But I think we resonate with people that are vulnerable, and you can sense that they've been a little wounded by life, and we have, and so they sometimes those talks resonate with us because they're speaking from personal experience.
well, it's yeah. So that vulnerability, and I think as you were saying that curiosity is a spiritual gift. I think vulnerability is a spiritual
I
gift.
love that. Yeah.
Yeah. That, yeah. Well, Richard, I think we could talk for hours and hours, but I just want to thank you for being here, for doing what you do, and for allowing people to share their stories and for sharing yours. And I just thank you for being here. I'm in the show notes of this podcast. I'll include the episodes to your, or the episodes, I'm sorry, the links to your books and to your podcast. And yeah, just so listeners can go and find those. And thank you for putting so much good out into the world. You're one of my heroes.
Thank you, Kristen.
Sending you a big hug through the screen.
Thank you.
And that so that's everything that I've got for you guys today. Make a great week and just sending you lots of love. Mwah!